The Comstock was remarkable because it was one of the richest gold and silver strikes in history. What also made it remarkable was that it took a good 20 years to excavate it. So for 20 years, from 1859 to 1880, this place had pretty much ongoing opulence. I'm standing at the base of the Ophir pit, and they called it Ophir after Ophir, the gold mine of King Solomon in the Old Testament. By asserting that this was the Ophir mine, they were claiming that this was a mine of biblical proportions. And they got it right, because hundreds of millions of dollars came out of the ground beginning right here. The first miners who came here were after gold. Gold's easy. Gold doesn't combine with many things, so you can actually even pick it out of their washed dirt with tweezers, and you hope for a nugget, but you find little flakes of gold, and that's how you can pull the gold out. What they weren't expecting was anything else that would be valuable. The two miners who were coming up here, a couple of Irish immigrants, were just looking for a good place to dam up a natural spring so they could get water, because they were placer mining like the original California gold miners of 1849, and they were hoping that they could find some water, throw some dirt into their long toms, which were these wooden boxes, and wash the dirt. While they were damming a natural spring they found, which was right up here, they started throwing some of the dirt in there and found immediately that they were uncovering several ounces of gold. And it was a very good day, and it was the first of many good days. In fact, 20 years worth of good days. They were complaining for those first few weeks after the strike in June of 1859. These early miners complained about this blue mud that gummed up their works, because as you wash away the lighter soil, it leaves gold behind, but it was also leaving behind this blue mud that was really obnoxiously heavy, and it was hard to separate it from the gold. So after several weeks, they took an ore sample over to California and said, what exactly do we have here? And what they found was that if you had a ton of this stuff, it would produce over $800 in gold, when gold was selling for $16 an ounce. But what was really surprising that it would produce over $3,000 in silver, when silver was selling for $1.60 an ounce. And so that's really where everyone understood just how wealthy this ore body, or using the Cornish word lode, was, and then it became known as the Comstock Lode. What we're seeing here is a large open pit mine. We think of open pit mining as something that happens in the late 20th century and the 21st century. They were simply digging the gold and silver out of the ground from the surface, and you have to basically connect the dots from one point of the downward slope to the upward slope, and then you can reconstruct in your own mind where that hillside was. So the original strike was 50 or 60 feet above us somewhere in midair. We have no idea exactly where it was, because everything's been excavated out. Henry Comstock was a bit of a charlatan who happened upon the first two Irish miners who made the first strike up here on June 8th. That evening he showed up and recognized immediately that they had found something big and profitable. And so he said, you know, this is my land, and you're on my claim. And so they said, well, why don't you join us? And he said, well, okay, I'll join you, but I got another friend. So the four of them formed the first company of miners that excavated here. The people who came to the Comstock were an international body of people. Nevada actually had, in the 1870 census, more foreign-born per capita than any other state in the nation. You know, more than the great immigrant states of, you think of Massachusetts and Boston and New York, and how vibrantly international those places were, Chicago. A lot of Europeans, obviously, a large group of Chinese lived here. They came from all over. They often arrived as single men, and so it was a very masculine community. And there's no doubt that in 1860, when everyone was rushing into Virginia City and Gold Hill, that there were a fair number of fights and even a few weapons fired, but it wasn't as wild as Hollywood would lead us to believe. When Virginia City took off as one of the great mining capitals of the world, it was opulent, it was huge by comparison. Gold Hill and Virginia City probably reached 25,000, which sounds small, but actually for the time, that's a fairly large city. And out in the west, in the Intermountain West, it was a very substantial community, much bigger than Carson City. So Carson City fed off the opulence and the wealth of the Comstock. Once the open pit miners of 1859 realized they had reached a point that they were so deep that the sidewalls could collapse in on them, they realized they had to go underground. Probably occurred somewhere late 1859 to early 1860. Once you go underground, you need wooden supports, you need drills, you need a labor force, you need dynamite. You're dealing with hard rock, so you need a mill to crush the rock and then go through the milling process of extracting the gold and silver. It's a long process. They very quickly found a technological problem, which in most gold mines were really thrilled if they could follow a seam, a vein of gold that was 2 inches wide. But here, the Comstock Lode, the combination of gold and silver, started expanding as they went underground to 5 feet, 10 feet, and at its widest, up to 60 feet wide of nearly pure gold and silver. I mean, obviously mixed it with some rock, but you had to dig it all out. You couldn't stop doing that. The problem is you cannot find a log stout enough to span 60 feet, even 20 feet without snapping, because it has to hold up a mountain, and mountains want to collapse in on empty space. So they brought in a German immigrant by the name of Philip Deidesheimer, who developed the square set timbering method. And it was basically a series of cubes that could be in modular fashion added to, so that whatever the stope, the empty space left over when you dug out all the gold and silver, whatever that stope was shaped like, you could fill it up with a stout framework of timber. And then you would fill it back with waste rock as you dug even deeper inside the mine. So it was a really nice, stable way to support a mine as you were pursuing precious metals. And that was exported throughout the world. It's only the first of many inventions. Flat wire cable, the safety cage. This was the first place where dynamite was experimented with in a big way underground. It was the first place where air compressed drills were used. So it became one invention after the next that defined international underground mining for the next 50 or 60 years. The deepest shaft here dropped over 3,000 feet, 3,200 feet. It's over a half mile, a straight elevator drop. And keep in mind, this is in 1870, 1880, when most people have never ridden an elevator anywhere. And to imagine these people being dropped down over half miles straight down, it really is something. There was a law on the Nevada books that said it's against the law to talk to a hoist operator. He was the fellow who was running the spool as it lowered the cages down, and it's illegal to talk to a hoist operator while he's working, because if you distract him and he's off by 10 feet, that could be fatal to the guys in the cage as they drop down. Comstock Mines and the miners were really proud of the fact that they had a good safety record. It's hard to arrive at a good figure, but I estimate about one miner a week died on the Comstock Lode, with a workforce that sometimes reached 5,000 miners. And for the most part, it was a fairly safe place to work. There were some big disasters, of course. On April 9th, 1869, in Gold Hill, there was an underground fire at the 700-foot level. And so apparently there was a candle or something that had been left unattended, and it caused a fire. And as the morning shift descended, the fire had expanded enough that it had eaten away at some of the wooden supports. The part of the 700-foot level collapsed, and it flushed poisonous, smoky air into the adjacent mines of the Kentuck and the Crown Point. And so miners in all three mines, the Yellow Jacket, the Kentuck, and the Crown Point, were consumed by this bad air and by the flames. They quickly tried to get miners out. It was a disaster. And it was at least 35 or roughly 35 miners died in the incident. And it was the worst industrial accident in all of Nevada history. In 1873, they found what was called the Big Bonanza, which was a huge deposit of gold and silver that if Virginia City wasn't famous before, and it was, it then was permanently famous. And I'm not sure without the big bonanza we would have the Cartwrights and the television show Bonanza. That's what put Virginia City and the Comstock Lode on the international map forever. After that big bonanza strike in 1873, mined out by 1880, they'd never found that next big bonanza in the next 2 decades. It slumped pretty badly and entered into a real depression. By the turn of the century, they invented a new method for extracting gold and silver, which allowed for lower value ore bodies to be worked using cyanide, which sounds like a poison, but it actually is pretty innocuous, and it combines with the gold and silver, and it allows for extraction at a cheaper level. And so throughout the 20th century, cyanide processing allowed for the working of lower ore bodies, and that kept mines working throughout the 20th century. And now, beginning in 2010, Comstock Mining is excavating south of Gold Hill, an ore body that's fairly close to the surface, and is excavating an open pit. Not unlike this, except that it's a little larger in scale. The Comstock Lode produced a level of mining technology that was used internationally and influenced international mining from South Africa and Australia to Montana and Canada. So it set the stage for industrial modern mining the way it's practiced today.